"Who do you think you are? Wearing a suit doesn't change the fact you're still a monkey. Got it?" the cop growled, in the middle of the street under dozens of watching eyes. The black man didn't move. He just flipped out his badge. "I'm the one with the authority to throw your ass out. Right now." Caleb Monroe stood upright on the edge of Jefferson Street, between a shuttered eyewear shop and a snack store that had closed early. The morning sun, still pale, slanted down across the stained brick pavement left blotched from old rains. He didn't check his watch, nor did he seem impatient. His left hand held a folded document, his right rested lightly on his bag strap. He looked like someone who had every reason to be there, but no interest in explaining it to anyone. A girl, about 9 years old, walked past, clutching a cereal box, glanced at him, then whispered something to her mother. The woman said nothing, but the girl turned back and smiled. "You look like a superhero," she murmured, barely audible, then kept walking. The sound of a patrol car's engine cut through the quiet. A Ford pulled up at the curb, its door opening before the engine died. Blake Hurley stepped out, young, with a sharp buzz cut, shirt tucked crisply beneath a uniform jacket. His eyes held not curiosity, but judgment. He looked Caleb over, then tossed out a question like it didn't require an answer. "What's going on here?" Caleb turned, voice steady. "I'm standing." Blake frowned, stepped half a pace closer. "What are you selling?" Caleb didn't smile, didn't shrug. "Nothing. I'm waiting." Blake eyed the suit, the folder in Caleb's hand, and smirked. "Waiting for who? Some CO, or are you some kind of self-appointed manager?" He stretched the last words like he was savoring them. Caleb turned eastward, toward the sunlight not yet reaching the street. "I'm waiting for a car to go to work." "Does your workplace require an ID?" Blake asked, eyes flicking toward the squad radio, hand brushing the mic on his shoulder. Over the dispatch, a woman's voice came through. "Suspicious subject at Jefferson Corner. Black male, dark suit, no clear ID." The message repeated. Then again. Caleb closed his eyes. A strong gust swept through the trees behind him, lifting the hem of his coat. He didn't turn, didn't lower his head. Blake stepped back half a pace, his hand now hovering near his holster. "You're making me uncomfortable, standing here dressed like that. You don't look like someone heading to work." "Then what do I look like?" Caleb asked. His voice barely rose above the wind. Blake didn't hesitate. "Like a monkey waiting for orders." From a small lot across the street came the crash of a bowl. Someone stood up from a plastic chair, eyes wide. A child blinked at their mother. The street seemed to slow, like everything was holding its breath. Caleb didn't turn. He stepped forward once, then stopped. "That line," he said, "I first heard it when I was 6, on a schoolyard. Kids threw banana peels in my face and told me to eat like I was supposed to." Blake's brow tightened, but he said nothing. "I thought adults didn't speak like that," Caleb continued, "and police officers surely wouldn't." Blake sneered, enunciating each word. "I'm doing my job. I have the right to ask and to suspect." Caleb tilted his head slightly, as if considering a step back, but he didn't move. "Do you have the right to insult someone for the color of their skin? You're causing a disturbance," Blake snapped. "Show me your ID." Caleb reached into his chest pocket. Immediately, Blake drew his weapon. "Put your hand down," I said. "Put your hand down." The shout rang across the block, echoing sharply off the opposite wall. A baby screamed from inside a stroller. A nearby man raised his hands. "He's just getting his wallet." Caleb froze. Then, slowly, deliberately, he pulled out a slim leather wallet. He opened it, lifted it high. In the thick air, the sunlight caught the silver lettering on the card inside. Caleb Monroe, Chief of Police, Metropolitan Unit. A man in the back gasped, "Oh my God!" Blake stood frozen. His hand still gripped the gun, but it trembled. The trigger hadn't been pulled, but everything had already spun out of control. Caleb held the badge high. He said nothing, just looked until the other man's eyes could no longer look back. Blake walked slowly toward Caleb, as if the space between them was a boundary he needed to erase. Not through understanding, but through dominance. The arrogance wasn't in his steps, but in his eyes. He didn't need a reason to suspect Caleb, because the reason was written on the man's skin, and Blake believed that was enough. "You think standing still is going to confuse me," Blake said, his words sharp, dripping with open contempt. "Black folks dressed like you look like monkeys trying to act human." The air tightened. A sharp clink rang out, not from a gunshot, but from a coffee cup falling onto the pavement. The shards scattered, one piece landing near a woman by the bus stop. She froze, her eyes locked onto Blake's face, then shifted to the man standing tall before the cold muzzle of a gun. A young man across the street stepped back and pulled out his phone. He didn't raise it right away. His thumb hovered over the record button, trembling, not from fear but from disbelief. Some words weren't supposed to be spoken, especially not by someone wearing the badge of justice. Caleb remained still, but his gaze locked onto Blake's. Deep, slow, and still, like sedimentary rock, that look didn't slice through Blake. It exposed him. A crack began to form. Not in the crowd, but in the officer's own mind, hand still gripping the weapon. Caleb furrowed his brow slightly. I've heard that before, in 1986, when a white kid screamed it in my face on the schoolyard, he said. He threw a banana peel at me and told me to go back to the jungle. His tone carried no bitterness. The words seemed rehearsed in memory, softened enough not to wound the listener, but sharp enough to pierce the one who'd said it first. Blake laughed. "Oh, here we go," he muttered, shaking his head. "Guess we got ourselves a little show today. Stay still so I can check your pockets." The sentence wasn't a command, it was a rip, a tearing of the last thread of patience Jefferson Street had left. A woman with a stroller turned her back. A store clerk stepped outside, watching from afar, disbelief plain in his eyes. A student moved 2 steps forward and finally raised his phone. No one said anything, but it was that silence that thickened the air. Blake lifted his right hand. "Raise your hands, Mr. Monroe." For the first time, Caleb said his own name first. "You know who I am now." Blake didn't lower his hand. He stepped in. "I've seen fakes before. Names, titles, badges, all over the internet. I'll ask one more time. Hands up." Caleb raised his hands slowly, every motion deliberate. His wrists were steady. His eyes stayed locked. It wasn't about winning. He refused to become a specimen for someone else's fear. "All right," he said. "Go ahead and check." Blake moved closer, left hand unsnapping the cuffs, right still holding the gun. He motioned for Caleb to turn around. Caleb didn't move. He tilted his head slightly. "You sure you want to lay hands on the newly appointed head of this state's police department?" Blake stopped. The words didn't come out loud, but like a stone dropped into a still lake, they sent ripples. A soft sound, spoken at the right moment, can carry the weight of 100 screams. A woman's voice rose from the crowd, barely above a whisper. "Is he really the chief?" A man nodded beside her. "Just got promoted earlier this week. I read it in the paper." Blake still held his gun, but his gaze began to shift, no longer fixed on Caleb. It moved to the faces, inching closer. Each face was a mirror. Caleb slowly lowered his hands, reached into his inner jacket pocket, pulled out his wallet, opened it, and held it up in front of Blake. Once again, the sunlight caught the silver lettering. "Caleb Monroe," he said clearly, each syllable deliberate. "Chief of Police, Metropolitan Unit." Blake stepped back, then another step. The arm holding his gun began to falter, not yet lowered but no longer firm. He opened his mouth to speak, but his throat clenched. "I didn't resist you," Caleb said, his voice quiet but steady. "I stood still. I answered. I did nothing wrong. And you called me a monkey." No one responded. No one defended. Something heavier than shame moved through the street, the weight of having just witnessed a truth so bare, so unforgiving, that turning away was no longer an option. Blake stood in the sunlight, between a gun not yet lowered and a badge still gleaming. Caleb did not retreat. He looked Blake in the eye once more, not with steel, but with release. Not forgiveness, just a refusal to grant the man the weight of his anger. A child in the crowd tugged at his mother's hand. "Mom, is that man really a police officer?" She nodded. "He's the head of the whole department." The child paused. "Then why did the other one scream at him?" No one had an answer. Caleb turned away. 3 steps. Not fast, no urgency. His black shoes tapped against the pavement, each step echoing like a funeral drum for something that had just died, something no one wanted to admit had ever lived. Caleb Monroe reached into the inner pocket of his coat. His movement wasn't fast or sudden, but it was enough to trigger every defensive instinct in the man across from him. Blake immediately drew his gun, a reflex drilled into him through hundreds of hours at the shooting range. His eyes widened and his palm gripped the handle tightly. He shouted, "Put it down! I said put it down!" The shout tore through the air, sharp and blinding like a siren charging into a crowd. Another sound followed, quieter but cutting like a blade. Imani's scream. The child yelled from across the street, "Don't shoot!" Her voice didn't carry far, but it pierced through every heart. No one knew who she was, but her cry became the final warning from the part of humanity not yet frozen. A middle-aged man nearby rushed forward, grabbing Blake's arm with both hands. "What the hell are you doing? That's a wallet! I saw him pull out a wallet!" Blake shoved the man aside, his aim thrown slightly off, but the gun was still raised. "I'm controlling the situation," he yelled, as if volume alone could drown out the panic inside his head, but the situation was no longer in his control. It had slipped, falling into the grip of dozens of wide-open eyes, into the ears recording every word, every breath. Caleb paused for a moment. He glanced at the man who'd intervened, his eyes showing a flicker of gratitude. Then he slowly pulled out the wallet, opened it, and lifted a leather badge holder high above his head. The dark leather was clean, edges sharp, without embellishment. The badge caught the sunlight, reflecting cold silver text. Caleb Monroe, Chief of Police, Metropolitan Unit. No one said a word, no one dared. The silence lasted only seconds, but it wasn't empty. It was a vacuum between insult and consequence. Caleb lowered his hand, still holding the badge before his chest. He stepped half a pace toward Blake. "I'm Caleb Monroe," he said in a voice just loud enough. "Newly appointed Chief of Police. 72 hours ago." Blake didn't react right away. His face froze like stone. His lips twitched, then locked still, as if he himself couldn't believe what was happening. His hand trembled slightly, not much, but enough to make the trigger line blur. A withered leaf drifted down from the tree above, twirled once in the air, then landed on Caleb's polished shoes. It rested quietly on the toe, a small contrast to the tension stretching around them. Caleb looked down, ate, and didn't brush it away. He raised his face, eyes locked onto Blake's. "If I hadn't pulled out this badge," he asked slowly, each word nailed into the air, "how far would this have gone?" Blake didn't answer, maybe because he didn't know, or maybe because he'd just realized that question needed no answer. From behind, someone laughed, not out of amusement, but from the choke of realization, a laugh bursting from the truth that an entire system had stood idle, letting a man defend his humanity not with his dignity, but with his title. A woman stepped forward from the crowd, phone still raised in her hand. She looked at Blake, then at Caleb, and blurted out, "Why did he have to show a badge just to be seen as human?" Caleb didn't turn to her. His eyes remained on Blake. "I don't need your respect because of my title," he said, "but I need to know, without this title, would I have made it off this street alive?" Blake took a step back, the gun in his hand lowered, not out of will, but because it no longer belonged there. He holstered it, then looked down at the pavement as if searching for something he had lost. Blake started to speak, but then fell silent. He said nothing more. No one else spoke either. Those around slowly lowered their phones, but no one stopped recording. Not out of fear of missing something, but because they knew no words needed to be added to this moment. Caleb closed the badge, returned it to his wallet, and slid the wallet back into his coat. He turned, but didn't walk away yet. He left one final question. "Next time, if the man in the suit isn't me, if the one standing there has no badge, what will you do differently?" That question wasn't for Blake alone. It was for everyone. For the person filming, the one watching, the one staying silent, and the one who always thought they had nothing to do with it. Caleb walked away. His footsteps landed on the brick road in a slow rhythm. No one stopped him. No one called out. No one clapped. But one thing was clear. The badge he raised today wasn't for display. It was final proof of a cruel truth, that sometimes the right to live with dignity is only granted when we're forced to prove we have enough power. The leaf still rested on the toe of his shoe, silent. From the corner of a cafe called Tonic, frequented mostly by office workers who favored black coffee and stable Wi-Fi, Eric Dow kept his phone camera rolling in portrait mode. A senior journalism student, he had been working on a series about law enforcement culture and the moral silences in urban life. This morning's incident wasn't in his plan, but when the words "look like a monkey trying to act human" blared through the patrol car's speaker, he stood up immediately. His first shot shook slightly, but wasn't bad. He zoomed in slowly, capturing the exact moment the badge was pulled out. His phone screen displayed a caption he'd typed himself. "Cop calls chief a monkey?" It wasn't clickbait. It didn't exaggerate. It was just a question. At that alone made his finger freeze. At close range, Blake's voice faltered, sounding like an apology that didn't make it. I didn't know who you were." Caleb didn't respond right away. He took a step forward, leaving less than an arm's length between them. The man who had just been insulted didn't look down, didn't avert his gaze. In his eyes there was no contempt, no judgment, only something still and waiting to see what the other man would do with whatever was left of his humanity. "I don't need you to know who I am," Caleb said, his voice low but unshakable. "I need you not to call anyone a monkey, even when they don't have a badge." That sentence wasn't aimed at Blake alone. It passed right through him, glided past the cafe's chairs, past the waitress who had stopped wiping tables long ago. It passed through Eric Dow, who was no longer watching through his screen but looking directly, witnessing the gap between posture and the weight of words. Across the street, Imani clutched her mother's hand. She didn't yet know what chief meant, but she knew that man's eyes didn't look like someone who had to be afraid. "Mom," she whispered, "I think he really is a superhero." Her mother leaned down without answering. She wasn't sure her daughter understood everything, but she knew some things needed to be remembered before they could be fully understood. An older woman nearby began to cry. No one reached out to comfort her. She didn't sob aloud, and it wasn't an easy kind of emotion. Perhaps she had seen this too many times, but never something that cut this sharply. A man publicly insulted who responded with stillness that shamed an entire system. Eric slowly zoomed in on Caleb. The footage trembled slightly, but he didn't cut. On the live stream, the viewer count started climbing, from hundreds to thousands. One person commented, "Who is he?" Another replied, "Chief, just got appointed. I just Googled it." Another line rolled across the screen, "Blake's done for." In the middle of Jefferson Street, where just 3 minutes earlier a confrontation had stretched tight as wire, a different lesson was unfolding, one with no syllabus. Blake looked around. Everyone was staring at him. No one looked afraid anymore. No one looked down. Even those who had said nothing now stood taller. He swallowed hard. His face turned red, not from rage, but perhaps, for the first time, realizing the slope between the authority he was used to wielding and the respect he'd never learned how to give. Caleb remained still, but something had shifted. The air was no longer thick. It had begun to crack open. A change had taken place, quiet and unforced, yet unmistakable and irreversible. Like the moment a crowd collectively realizes they don't have to pretend they didn't see. Imani asked again, her voice barely more than a breeze. "If he wasn't the chief, would he have been shot, Mom?" Her mother stayed silent a little longer, then answered slowly, softly, "Maybe." The child didn't cry, but her grip tightened, as if she had just learned something no one had meant to teach her, something that shouldn't exist at the age of 9. The live stream kept running. Live 3.4K watching now, blinked at the corner of the screen. Eric didn't speak, but the shape of his first commentary was already forming in his mind. When insult becomes reflex, only those who know how to stand still at the right moment can turn the strike back. Caleb turned his head. His eyes moved across the scene, from Eric to the cafe worker, from the crying elderly woman to the man Blake had shoved. Each person had seen something they couldn't unsee. He didn't need to declare anything, didn't need to rally anyone. What needed to be understood was already suspended in the air. Blake stepped backward. He didn't draw his gun again. He didn't apologize, but he had nothing left to say. Every second he remained was another second stripped bare, and now The whole city was watching. Eric ended the live stream, but he knew the story wasn't over. It had just begun. Caleb remained still, but something had shifted. The air was no longer thick. It had begun to crack open. A change had taken place, quiet and unforced, yet unmistakable and irreversible, like the moment a crowd collectively realizes they don't have to pretend they didn't see. Imani asked again, her voice barely more than a breeze. "If he wasn't the chief, would he have been shot, Mom?" Her mother stayed silent a little longer, then answered slowly, softly, "Maybe." The child didn't cry, but her grip tightened, as if she had just learned something no one had meant to teach her, something that shouldn't exist at the age of 9. The live stream kept running. Live 3.4K watching now, blinked at the corner of the screen. Eric didn't speak, but the shape of his first commentary was already forming in his mind. When insult becomes reflex, only those who know how to stand still at the right moment can turn the strike back. Caleb turned his head. His eyes moved across the scene, from Eric to the cafe worker, from the crying elderly woman to the man Blake had shoved. Each person had seen something they couldn't unsee. He didn't need to declare anything, didn't need to rally anyone. What needed to be understood was already suspended in the air. Blake stepped backward. He didn't draw his gun again. He didn't apologize. But he had nothing left to say. Every second he remained was another second stripped bare. And now, the whole city was watching. Eric ended the live stream, but he knew the story wasn't over. It had just begun. Blake opened his mouth, maybe to justify himself, to apologize, or just to push back against the silence hanging over him like a keychain around his throat. But before he could speak, a soft sound broke through. Not loud, not sharp, but enough to make every head turn. The badge pinned to the left side of his chest dropped to the brick pavement, landing with a thin clink, like a name tag no longer attached to the right person. It didn't fall because of the wind, but because his hand trembled. The moment his fingers touched his shirt, the worn clip gave out, as if even the badge itself refused to hold on to someone no longer steady enough to carry it. Blake bent down, slowly reaching for it, but stopped halfway. His fingers hovered above the ground, his palm open but unwilling to close. For a moment he saw himself, from the outside, reflected in the eyes of the crowd, and perhaps, for the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to be seen not with fear, but with disappointment. Eric Dow stepped forward, phone still warm in his hand. He approached Caleb, keeping a respectful distance. "Do you want me to take the video down?" he asked, voice low but clear. It wasn't fear that drove the question, but respect. Caleb didn't look at Eric. He looked forward, toward the idle patrol car, toward the slivers of sunlight beginning to stretch across the sidewalk. "I want you to keep it," he said, "so no one ever has to explain this again." Eric nodded. He didn't ask further. He knew the answer wasn't just about the footage, but about collective memory, the kind of society that always tries to bury, blur, and pretend never happened. But today, someone had refused to be a silent victim, and refused easy forgiveness, too. The crowd moved closer, not chaotic, not shoving. They came forward as if drawn by something beyond curiosity. A white man in his 40s, tie loosened, walked slowly toward Caleb. He stood still for a moment, then spoke, loud enough to be heard, but not loud enough for the cameras. "We're sorry." Caleb turned to look at him, not harshly, not accusing. "Don't apologize to me," he said. "Teach your children not to become the next Blake." The man nodded. He understood, because perhaps he too had once been a Blake, or had stayed silent when someone like Blake acted. And that silence, now, weighed heavier than any insult ever spoken. Eric's camera tilted upward. He captured one final shot before ending the recording. The polished brass sign on the building directly behind Caleb. District 6 Police Department. Center of Justice. The letters were clean and sharp, carved like a declaration from a place meant to symbolize order. But in the late morning light, the plaque reflected the image of Caleb's black shoes, steady, still, facing forward. He didn't move. He didn't step back. He stood as if he had just done what anyone wearing a badge is supposed to do. prove that justice isn't defined by the words etched into a wall, but by how we treat someone who looks nothing like us. Imani kept watching from across the street. Her hand slipped from her mother's grasp. Her eyes followed, not because she understood everything, but because she sensed something larger than what adults usually explain. In Caleb's silence, she saw an image no words could define. Someone who knew exactly who he was and didn't need to shout to prove it. Blake still had his head down. He didn't step forward and he didn't leave. The badge sat in his hand, warming slowly from his own touch. But it was no longer a symbol of authority. It was evidence. And he was beginning to feel the full weight of something he used to wear as part of his uniform, not part of his character. Caleb looked at him one last time, not to condemn, but to offer a chance to understand what had been lost, and whether it was something still worth finding. That morning didn't end with sirens, arrests, or violence. It ended with silence, between eyes that had changed, with a badge raised not to impress, but to ask this entire society one question: how many titles does it take for a human to be seen as human? Caleb turned and walked toward the steps of the police station. Each step echoed like a knock on the conscience of a system too used to looking past instead of looking in. The camera stopped recording, but what it captured didn't stop. The video would spread, but what would spread faster than the footage was the truth. Today, a chief had to raise a badge to protect his life, and hundreds had seen it, unable to look away. The video Eric Dow recorded was uploaded at 10:17 a.m. It was a 3-minute, 42-second cut. No music, no effects, no need for a caption beyond a single question. You called the chief a monkey? That title spread faster than any attempt to explain. Within an hour, the clip had appeared on 4 major platforms. By noon, it had been trimmed into 10 shorter versions. Each offered a different angle, but reached the same conclusion. No one could pretend they didn't see anymore. On Twitter, the first reaction surfaced instantly. Who is Caleb Monroe? New chief? Since when? Is he really the chief? But within minutes, responses split into 2 clear camps. One side didn't wait for confirmation and declared outright, that cop should be fired. There's no excuse for using that word, especially with someone holding a badge. The other side pushed back just as hard. How was he supposed to know who the guy was? It was just a slip. People are too sensitive. Comments didn't stop at public platforms. Private law enforcement groups shared the video at lightning speed. One wrote, "Another case, Justice Media Edition." Another replied, "If he said that to my mother, I wouldn't care if he was the chief or the president." In a group of former Federal Academy officers, one posted, "Blake's biggest mistake wasn't the insult. It was not realize Zeed crossed a line when the person in front of him didn't need a title to deserve respect." On national television, a talk show invited 2 guests, a white journalist who had covered urban politics and a black social activist. Within the first 5 minutes, the host asked, "Is Mr. Monroe leveraging his position to push a victim narrative? Has the public overreacted?" The host hadn't even finished the question before social media erupted. The show's title was flagged by viewers, "Double Insult." This isn't about who he is, it's about how you speak to someone whose name you don't know. In a post shared over 200,000 times, Professor Marlene Jacobs from Columbia University wrote, "The problem isn't the identity of the person insulted. The problem is how natural it was for the insulter. When a slur slips out that easily, it's not a mistake, it's a belief." The post was screenshotted, reshared on Instagram, and turned into the background for dozens of stories, each stamped with a raised fist emoji and the words, "We don't need to be chief to deserve respect." Eric Dow received a message from a senior editor. "Are you willing to license the rights to the clip?" Eric didn't respond. He quietly switched the video from public to limited sharing, not to retract it, but to affirm that the story was not for sale. Everything had moved beyond his control, but not beyond its meaning. At 2 p.m., a group of public attorneys released a statement. "The use of racially offensive language by someone in a position of legal authority, under any circumstance, is a violation of public ethics. We call for an immediate internal investigation." 47 minutes later, a right-wing outlet reposted the headline with the caption, "Words on trial in the court of morality." A comment below read, "Soon we won't be allowed to say anything at all." but the pushback was louder. One user posted a screenshot from the video, paused at the moment the chief's badge was raised. The caption read, "You didn't need to know who he was, but now you do." The top comment said, "And that's why you backed off." That evening, several high schools held emergency assemblies, screening the video as a civic ethics resource. At one school in Baltimore, a white student stood up afterward and said, "I didn't think that word could carry so much weight until I saw his face not change." The teacher replied, "It's because his face didn't change that you could feel the weight." At the same time, a group of African-American mothers in Georgia live-streamed a discussion. One shared, "My son was called Monkey in 3rd grade. I asked the school to step in. They said, 'Kids just joke like that. Today I realizeth that joke grows up and wears a badge.'" In his office, Caleb Monroe turned off his phone notifications after learning the video had passed 1 million views. He didn't smile. He wasn't angry. He simply wrote one line in the notebook on his desk. "This wouldn't have gone viral if I didn't have a badge. The question is, how are those without badges seen?" He closed the notebook. Outside his window, the sunlight withdrew from the pavement, leaving behind a long gray streak, like an echo that doesn't fade. Amid the media storm, as the video surpassed 1 million views and the comments began touching the rawest nerves of society, a blog post appeared on a little-known education site. The title was quiet. "I used to laugh when I said that." The author was a white, middle-aged history teacher at a high school in Indiana. He wrote, "In 2009, I joked with a black student that if he didn't do his homework, I'd call him a lazy monkey. The whole class laughed, and I laughed too." 14 years later, watching the video of Caleb Monroe standing still in the street, I felt sick, not because of anyone else, but because of me. The post spread quickly, especially among teachers of color who had been compared to animals by students or colleagues. One comment read, "You saw your face in the mirror and realized it wasn't your skin." Another said, "We don't need apologies, we need internal change before the world strips us bare." At the same time, another image went viral. Shot from a distance, the angle didn't need a face to capture the weight. Caleb Monroe, sitting on a bench outside a government building, head slightly bowed, hands resting on his knees. Beside him was Imani, the little girl who had called him a superhero. In the photo, she looked up at him, wide-eyed, her hand resting on the edge of the bench. No captions, no gestures. The image was named by the online community, "A superhero in a suit who knows when to be silent." The image appeared on newspaper covers, education forums, and even as posters in classrooms across the South. A veteran journalist commented, "A photo without slogans, blood, or protests, but it forces us to rethink how we define courage." Meanwhile, 3 hashtags dominated the digital space. Not Your Monkey led the wave, with thousands sharing stories of being compared, named, or animalized. Each post was a cut into the mirror America often chooses to see itself through. One wrote, "I was first called a monkey at age 6 on a school bus." Another shared, "My university professor once joked that my skin belonged in the jungle, not the lab." Below each line came waves of outrage, but no one seemed surprised anymore. Chief Not Token emerged later, but just as powerfully. It didn't frame Caleb Monroe as a political figure, but as a symbol of what many people of color in public institutions have long feared, being elevated for image but left unprotected when storms come. A black journalist wrote, "Caleb didn't speak to defend his title. He stood still to defend the dignity of those who'll never have one." The third hashtag, "Silence is a Stance," stirred debate but also reflection. Some objected silence can be complicity, but most understood its context here. Caleb didn't shout, didn't retaliate with violence, didn't demand allegiance. He simply stood, and that silence exposed everything. 1 week later, a school in Brooklyn printed Caleb's quote across the entire glass facade of its main building. The words stretched across the transparent surface like a declaration. "I don't need you to know who I am. I need you not to call anyone a monkey." At the opening ceremony, the principal didn't speak about academic targets or rankings. She simply pointed to the quote and said, "We begin here. Before knowing who's an honors student or a winner, we must know who's a human being." At another school in Texas, the weekly sociology lesson turned into a discussion. A white student stood up and said, "I never thought calling someone a monkey was that horrible. I've seen parody clips using the word." The teacher replied, "Because you've never been the one called that, but now you know, and you can't pretend you don't." Caleb Monroe remained silent during those days. He didn't appear on television. He didn't release any official statements. His office declined all interview requests. But that didn't lessen the impact. Instead, it made everyone else's actions sharper, because when the eye of a storm chooses silence, everything around it must speak louder. Teachers, students, parents, journalists, the man behind the video, those who once laughed when someone was compared to an animal, all seemed to be looking into themselves through a mirror, beginning to crack. And through those cracks, light started to come in. 3 days after the incident, a short article appeared in the investigative section of the Capitol Witness. No color photos, no sensational headline, just a scanned copy of an official appointment letter bearing Caleb Monroe's name and the blue ink stamp of City Hall. The date, 3 days before the Jefferson Street incident. The final line on the document appeared fainter than the rest, perhaps due to the scanner. Replacing Chief Robert Sturgis, retired due to medical reasons. Those who knew Sturgis admitted he left quietly, and the man replacing him began with a noise no one could have predicted. The scanned document was more than paperwork. It served as final confirmation for the doubtful. Caleb Monroe was not just a victim, not just a witness, but the highest-ranking official in the city's justice system at the very moment he was publicly insulted. That raw contradiction left no room for gray areas. Every question demanded a black or white answer. And the biggest question, what if Caleb had arrived a week later? One Twitter user reposted a still from the video with the caption, "If he showed up a week later, he'd just be a black man in a suit badge, no authority, no one filming." The tweet was shared over 300,000 times, spreading into academic circles, law enforcement forums, and immigrant community groups. One commenter wrote, "This time, there was a badge. What about next time?" Another added, "Survival shouldn't be a privilege printed on a business card." Caleb Monroe's office received over 2,000 emails in the first 48 hours. Not all were supportive. Some accused him of leveraging his position to manipulate public sentiment. Others demanded his resignation to preserve the department's image. But most messages weren't about the event. They were about the deeper truth it revealed. One particular email left his secretary speechless. "You survived. My husband didn't." Signed, Alma H., with an old blurry photo attached, showing a black man in a white shirt pinned to the pavement, a knee on his neck, arms twisted behind him. The caption below read, "Baltimore, 2013. No video, no evidence, no going home." Caleb read that message late on the third day, as the city entered the artificial calm of nights following a media storm. He stared at the photo for a long while. He didn't reply, didn't print it out, but the next morning he posted one status, his first and only since the incident. "I don't want to be a role model. I want people to live without having to prove they deserve to." The sentence was typed on a white background in the platform's default font, with no image attached and no emojis. But within 3 hours, the post appeared on a giant lecture hall screen at a university in New York, quoted in the Washington Standard's editorial column, and assigned as a midterm essay topic for a high school class titled Civics and Power in Denver. And everywhere it was read, in different voices and accents, it ended the same way, in silence. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because too much had been said for too many years, while forgetting the most basic truth: a person does not need permission to live as a person. On a late-night interview show, the host asked the guest, "Why do you think that sentence resonated with so many people?" The guest, a Haitian-American law professor, replied, "Because it didn't ask anyone to change their political beliefs. It just asked them to change how they see a person without needing a title to begin showing respect." And so, Caleb's business card, the badge meant for unlocking conference rooms and approving budgets, bore a cut, not on its surface, but in the memory of a society. Everyone who saw that video, read that line, or watched that badge raised in the middle of the street understood one man stood there in place of thousands who had no badge, no luck, no camera, and sometimes no tomorrow. At a university out west, known for hosting discussions on free speech, gender bias, and academic power, a panel was held under a title that made many stop and read: The Line Between Position and Humanity. The conference room was set up in a circular format, with 5 gray chairs spaced evenly on stage. 4 were occupied. The 5th sat empty. That empty chair wasn't forgotten. It was the center. On its back was printed in bold, "You don't have to be chief to deserve respect." No one explicitly said it was for Caleb Monroe, but its presence, along with the eyes directed at it, made him the moderator of a conversation he didn't attend. A student said, "I used to think position protected black people from prejudice. Now I realize what needs changing isn't their titles, but how we see them when they have nothing to shield them but skin and eyes." The event wasn't loud, but it was heavy. Each speaker had to look inward. A sociology professor said, "When someone has to show their badge to defend their dignity, the system has created an ethical void no title can fill." The room fell into a silence that lasted 1 beat longer than usual. Meanwhile, in the city police department's HR office, a disciplinary notice was printed. Officer Blake Hurley was placed on temporary suspension. The final page bore the hesitant signature of his direct superior, as if even the person writing it couldn't believe it had taken nearly a week to write what was painfully obvious. The department held no press conference, no public inquiry. They issued a short statement: "We are reviewing actions inconsistent with departmental ethical standards." Still, another piece of information leaked faster than any press release. In a handwritten defense filed with the court to challenge potential administrative charges, Blake wrote a long paragraph, including this line: "I'm not prejudiced. I was just acting on instinct." Simple words, but they captured the heart of a national argument. What kind of instinct makes someone draw a gun when a man pulls out a wallet? What kind of instinct turns slurs into tools for assessing identity? On legal forums, debate around the word instinct flared. A law professor in Atlanta wrote, "If you call prejudice an instinct, you're accepting it as natural. And once that happens, injustice becomes rational." Her article was cited by many policy analysts, those who have long questioned training manuals that teach risk assessment based on skin color and posture. Caleb Monroe made no public comment on Blake's letter, but in a closed-door meeting with department heads, he opened with a line that made the room feel thick. If in someone's mind insult can be justified as instinct, then what needs rewriting isn't the report, it's the premise. The words were never written down, never shared outside the room, but everyone present remembered them, because no one could argue. In that room, the chair he sat in had no name tag, no number, but it was the first to be quietly pulled back a few inches, as if to say, "Position does not define character, distance does." And in a week when social media was flooded with slogans, arguments, and blame, it was an empty chair in a lecture hall, a letter citing instinct, and a statement that needed no recording that slowly but deeply shifted how people viewed justice. That justice isn't the image of an officer bowing his head, but a society that must learn to stand upright, not because someone was insulted, but because anyone could be next. A human rights organization, based in Chicago, issued a joint statement along with a 3-page analysis of Blake Hurley's letter. Early in the report, they underlined the phrase, "I was just acting on instinct," and compared it with over 20 cases of police abuse in the last decade, nearly all of which started with the same justification, acting on instinct. In the document, one line stood out, bolded and centered on a gray background, like a blade cutting to the heart of the issue. What kind of instinct allows someone to judge threat based on appearance? You don't need academia to understand it, just to have been looked at differently for your skin, your hair, or a suit that didn't match someone's expectations. That question wasn't aimed at Blake alone. It struck at a system that had cultivated the kind of instinct that treats lives as less worthy if the skin isn't pale enough. An activist wrote, "When one man pulls out a wallet and the other pulls out a gun, the instinct isn't about danger. It's about something planted long ago that was never uprooted. In a room hundreds of miles away, Eric Dow made his first podcast appearance, invited by a show known for interviewing social witnesses. His voice wasn't excited. The story didn't make him proud. The host asked, "Why didn't you step in? Stop it. Say something." Eric looked directly at the mic, not dodging. "Because last time I did, I got slapped," he said. "In a small park, I saw an Arab kid being held down. I said, he didn't do anything, and I got slapped. Not him, me. This time I recorded, and the world slapped back." That quote was clipped and became the most shared video of the day. In a society where silence is often seen as complicity, the confession helped people understand that sometimes filming is not cowardice. It's the last way to remain visible. A media critic commented, "When a citizen must choose between being slapped or hitting record in the hope someone behind a screen will care, it means that society has assigned cameras the job courage was supposed to have." Since that broadcast, Eric received hundreds of messages, many from people once labeled as bystanders. A single mother wrote, "I once saw people blame the person filming George Floyd for not saving him. Now I understand. That camera saved everyone who came after." Eric didn't reply to every message, but at a journalism seminar at his school, he stepped up, took the mic, and said only one sentence: "I'm not a hero. I just chose to keep the truth when I saw someone about to step on it." And so, in a confrontation without a gunshot, the camera became evidence, words became wounds, and instinct, once used as an excuse, was peeled back like a layer of skin on shattered glass. And society, even if not fully united, began to accept one thing: no one is born suspicious, but systems have been taught to suspect, and call it instinct. As the media continued to amplify the story, a group of retired officers from various states signed an open letter. They didn't appear on camera or join the heated online debates. They simply sent the letter to major news outlets with one clear message: the problem isn't just Hurley, it's the hours of training that taught him to see people as targets. The letter didn't defend Blake Hurley. It didn't praise Caleb Monroe either. It simply tore apart the idea of tactical instinct that generations of officers had been taught. It listed segments from rookie training programs, simulation drills, emergency scenarios, video clips that almost always portrayed threats as dark-skinned men in hoodies, moving fast, wearing suits in low-income neighborhoods. One section read, "When you teach someone again and again that danger has a look, they'll react to images instead of reason. And at that point, sight becomes the first weapon." The words weren't flowery, but each line carried the weight of people who had carried guns, worn badges, and faced the mirror each morning wondering who they might see as a threat that day. Soon after, a major TV network staged a reenactment. They conducted a social experiment with 30 active-duty officers, all anonymous. Each officer was shown rapid-fire images of white and non-white men in suits, holding briefcases, standing in various locations, on a corner, in a building lobby, at a bus stop. Each image was displayed for 3 seconds. The results made even the production crew question how they'd framed the test. 78% rated the non-white men as possibly impersonating someone, possibly disguising, or not matching their surroundings. The same suit on a white man, in the same setting, drew suspicion less than 12% of the time. The behavioral psychologist supervising the study concluded, "We've attached ID tags to human images. Since then, our reactions haven't come from caution, but from chemical bias." The segment aired during prime time with no melodramatic music, only raw sounds, mouse clicks, shallow breaths over photos, the soft tap of pens filling out forms. One participant said, "I didn't think I was profiling. I thought I was just following a feeling. But now I see that feeling was built for me by someone else." There was no official government response. The Department of Justice made no statement. But behind closed doors, curriculum developers received quiet orders: review your imagery, your language, your simulation structure. Not out of fear of backlash, but because, for the first time, there was enough proof that bias had been programmed into the system's reaction clock, into every minute hand and ticking second. In one internal roundtable, a senior officer blurted, "We don't need more policies. We need to dismantle the damn clock and see how it ticks." The quote spread, becoming the most shared status inside police network forums for 2 straight weeks. Simple, yet visceral. And for the first time, the system wasn't admiring itself, it was dissecting. When asked about the televised experiment results, Caleb Monroe gave a short reply. "If the clock sounds an alarm every time it sees someone like me, the problem isn't the person, it's the clock." Then he turned away, leaving his words like a cold slice across the system's face. Sharp, brief, needing no repetition. Among thousands of comments beneath analysis articles, reenactment videos, open letters, and televised segments, one short line rose beyond the comment sections to become a symbol. At first, it appeared quietly under a post by an independent journalist. "They're not afraid of you having a gun, they're afraid of you having a title, because that's when they lose the upper hand." It wasn't bolded, and it didn't get many likes right away, but it spread, each reader pausing for a second before scrolling, though never really leaving it behind. In a private forum for people who had experienced harassment by law enforcement, the quote was pinned. A member wrote, "I used to be a veteran. In uniform, they saluted me. In a t-shirt, driving a beat-up car, they asked for my papers. Status didn't save me. Only when they knew I outranked them did they back off." That story was cited across academic essays on power and bias. Those in positions of control often measured the room by who they can dominate and who they can't. The quote was printed on a small plaque hanging outside a nonprofit's office in Houston, just below its longtime slogan, "Equality is not optional." Now visitors passed under both lines, one an ideal, one a reality. Meanwhile, Caleb Monroe remained absent from the public eye. No speeches, no interviews, no statements on the outcomes of a debate now dominating national media. His office released only one brief note. 3 lines, no title, no signature. The first line declined interviews. The second confirmed no press conference. The third, instantly quoted by news outlets, read, "Justice doesn't come from me being respected. It comes from no one else needing to prove they're worthy of it." The statement needed no explanation. It landed like a period dropped into the eye of a storm, halting every attempt to frame Caleb as a hero or a system challenger. He refused to be celebrated in place of reform. He declined to become the exception that justifies a rule still crushing millions. In political philosophy classrooms, the quote was used to illustrate the refusal to become a symbol when that symbol blocks others from seeing the structure that must be dismantled. One student wrote, "I used to think justice was when the insulted got an apology. But Monroe's words showed me justice is when no one gets insulted, regardless of who they are." The memo circulated as an image, black background, white text, spreading quietly like a rejection of applause. Many began replacing hashtags bearing Caleb's name with broader ones. Respect needs no title. The shift wasn't loud, but it was deliberate. In the letters arriving at his office, handwritten messages began to outnumber digital ones. Some people choose to write rather than type. One elderly woman said, "I don't think you need to read this, but I need to write it, because for the first time, I believe in a sentence more than a reform plan." A recent graduate wrote, "I used to want to join the force to be respected. Now I want to join to make sure no one needs a title to feel safe." In another city, on the glass door of a bookstore, the owner taped up a printout of the quote with a handwritten note underneath. "You don't have to buy anything, but stand here and read." And in a week where institutions still wrestled with the question of what to do with Blake Hurley, most people had already found the answer for themselves. Start with how we see. Start by making sure no one ever has to pull out a business card just to be seen as human. When asked about the televised experiment results, Caleb Monroe gave a short reply. "If the clock sounds an alarm every time it sees someone like me, the The problem isn't the person, it's the clock. Then he turned away, leaving his words like a cold slice across the system's face, sharp, brief, needing no repetition. Among thousands of comments beneath analysis articles, reenactment videos, open letters, and televised segments, one short line rose beyond the comment sections to become a symbol. At first, it appeared quietly under a post by an independent journalist. They're not afraid of you having a gun. They're afraid of you having a title, because that's when they lose the upper hand. It wasn't bolded, and it didn't get many likes right away, but it spread, each reader pausing for a second before scrolling, though never really leaving it behind. In a private forum for people who had experienced harassment by law enforcement, the quote was pinned. A member wrote, "I used to be a veteran. In uniform, they saluted me. In a t-shirt, driving a beat-up car, they asked for my papers. Status didn't save me. Only when they knew I outranked them did they back off." That story was cited across academic essays on power and bias. Those in positions of control often measure the room by who they can dominate, or who they can't. The quote was printed on a small plaque hanging outside a nonprofit's office in Houston, just below its longtime slogan, "Equality is not optional." Now, visitors passed under both lines, one an ideal, one a reality. Meanwhile, Caleb Monroe remained absent from the public eye. No speeches, no interviews, no statements on the outcomes of a debate now dominating national media. His office released only one brief note, 3 lines, no title, no signature. The first line declined interviews. The second confirmed no press conference. The third, instantly quoted by news outlets, read, "Justice doesn't come from me being respected. It comes from no one else needing to prove they are worthy of it." The statement needed no explanation. It landed like a period dropped into the eye of a storm, halting every attempt to frame Caleb as a hero or a system challenger. He refused to be celebrated in place of reform. He declined to become the exception that justifies a rule, still crushing millions. In political philosophy classrooms, the quote was used to illustrate the refusal to become a symbol when that symbol blocks others from seeing the structure that must be dismantled. One student wrote, "I used to think justice was when the insulted got an apology, but Monroe's words showed me justice is when no one gets insulted, regardless of who they are." The memo circulated as an image, black background, white text, spreading quietly, like a rejection of applause. Many began replacing hashtags bearing Caleb's name with broader ones. Respect needs no title. The shift wasn't loud, but it was deliberate. In the letters arriving at his office, handwritten messages began to outnumber digital ones. Some people choose rather than type. One elderly woman said, "I don't think you need to read this, but I need to write it, because for the first time, I believe in a sentence more than a reform plan." A recent graduate wrote, "I used to want to join the force to be respected. Now I want to join to make sure no one needs a title to feel safe." In another city, on the glass door of a bookstore, the owner taped up a printout of the quote with a handwritten note underneath, "You don't have to buy anything, but stand here and read." And in a week where institutions still wrestled with the question of what to do with Blake Hurley, most people had already found the answer for themselves. Start with how we see. Start by making sure no one ever has to pull out a business card just to be seen as human. On Thursday morning, the City Hall auditorium was packed, yet no one smiled, no one jostled for space. The air felt coated in white chalk dust, still and taut. At the center of the chamber, a long bench for officials was draped in thick gray cloth, topped with a single microphone awaiting the first voice. It was a special hearing, convened with rare urgency, just 3 days after independent investigation results were released in the press. No one dared call it an incident anymore. It had long ceased to be personal. Presiding over the session was Mayor Raquel Jensen, a white woman serving her second term, once seen as the emblem of political neutrality in the city's racial disputes. Few remembered she had trained alongside Caleb Monroe at the police academy in the late 90s, when diversifying the force was still a blurry slogan in training manuals. Many had forgotten, but she had not. When the mic turned on, Jensen didn't read an opening statement. She didn't mention procedures or titles. Instead, she looked straight into the camera lens, then down at her desk, as if reading something only she could see. Today we don't ask who was right. We ask, why has wrong become familiar? No applause followed, but the room froze for a second. The question demanded no answer, but forced everyone to revisit what they had once avoided. Raquel Jensen lifted her head, scanning the front row where law enforcement representatives sat still as stone. To her left was the empty seat reserved for someone to speak on behalf of Caleb Monroe, who had declined to send anyone. He didn't see the hearing as a place to defend himself. To her right sat the police department's representative, a white man with graying hair, holding the rank of lieutenant colonel, authorized to speak for Blake Hurley. He stepped to the microphone, buttoned his blazer, and read slowly from a 3-paragraph sheet. There was no apology, no mention of regret or accountability, just a brief closing line. We respect the ongoing investigation and await the Internal Oversight Board's conclusions. Not a sound came from the audience. Raquel Jensen didn't blink. She tilted her head slightly, clasped her hands on the table, and spoke with a chill so sharp it made the microphone seem sharper too. Respect is not enough, she said, and if an officer hides behind the word investigation to escape ethics, then that department must ask itself, who is it protecting? No one in the police department's row responded. The lieutenant colonel's face stayed still, as if trained not to register emotion. Further back, a young coordinator glanced sideways at a colleague and whispered, "Cold as ice." Jensen didn't pause. She called for a full reading of all racial discrimination complaints within the police department over the past 5 years, including cases never covered by the media. Over half of the cases ended with the phrase, "insufficient evidence for internal action." It was a truth everyone knew, but always spoke softly, as if whispering long enough might make it disappear. The hearing wasn't over, but the mood in the room had crystallized. This was no longer about a single officer or a badge. It had become a reverse measurement of how far silence can freeze when placed under direct light. Just as the session seemed to slip into the rhythm of bureaucratic procedure, a witness stepped forward from the last row, holding a security cap, his faded shirt ironed as if for a regular workday. No introduction was needed. Many in the room had seen him before, stationed by the corner of the commercial complex across from the Jefferson bus stop. He was George Tillman, the silent gatekeeper of the neighborhood for nearly 3 decades. He didn't bring a prepared statement, didn't adjust the mic. He simply placed his hand on the wooden podium, looked directly at the officials' row, and said, "I've worked for 28 years. I've seen thieves run, shoppers fall, students argue with police, and drunks smash glass. But I've never seen anyone stand like Mr. Monroe did while being insulted." His voice was hoarse but steady. For a moment, the entire room seemed to sag under the weight of a simple testimony. George didn't use grand words. He cited no principles, laws, or ethics. He just recalled what everyone had seen on a screen, but he had witnessed with his own eyes, in real air, with the heart of someone who had once been yelled at to get off the curb for standing in the wrong spot. I saw his eyes not move, even when that officer raised his gun. I stood behind the stone pillar, too afraid to step forward. I was scared, he continued. But he wasn't, not because he was the chief, but because he knew what should never be said out loud, even by someone who thinks they're allowed. Some bowed their heads. A woman in the second row pulled out a tissue. George said no more. He gave a slight nod and walked back to his seat. Each step felt like closing a door that had stayed open too long, where silence had once passed for caution instead of consequence. As the session drew to a close, the light in the hall had softened. Raquel Jensen closed the folder in front of her, set her pen aside, and read slowly, not a resolution, not a statement, but a line quoted hundreds of times from the now famous clip. "I need you not to call anyone a monkey, even if they don't have a badge." She didn't look up immediately. For a few seconds it was as if all sound had been pushed out, leaving only the whisper of thin paper brushing wood as she closed her file. Then Jensen raised her head, looked at each person in the room, and said, "Because a business card is not armor for dignity." No one clapped. No one needed to. Words like those aren't born for applause. They're made to split things open, and in that exact moment, under cold lights and thick silence, many began to wonder, how many times have we only respected someone because we saw a badge, a title, a rank? And if someone carried nothing in their pocket but their name, would our gaze still stand as upright as it does today? No sirens escorted him, no cameras tracked his every step. The city prosecutor's office issued only a single internal notice. A special counsel had been appointed to oversee the case involving Officer Hurley, with full authority to request supplementary investigation. The assigned name, Malik Sanborn, a figure long associated with complex cases of discrimination and abuse of power, yet never seen smiling for media cameras. Sanborn, a Trinidadian by descent, grew up in a low-income neighborhood in North Miami, where every courtroom felt like a stage not meant for people like him. A full scholarship law graduate, he had served as special advisor across 3 different states before returning to this city. On paper, he remained low profile, but in legal circles it was clear. When Malik Sanborn was sent, it meant the system had run out of time to fix itself. He arrived at Internal Affairs at 6:48 a.m. before the sun had risen above the administrative building's roof. No entourage, no assistant, just him, carrying a slim leather briefcase that held a list of requested items, all records tied to professional conduct, citizen complaints, internal grievances, not just for Officer Hurley, but also for his direct supervisor over the last 5 years. He was received by a senior administrative inspector who, after scrawling through the system for a few minutes, asked quietly, "You want even the unclassified files?" Sanborn replied without pause, "I want every report ever delayed for insufficient grounds to proceed." The investigation didn't begin with a press conference or the typical working seriously media photo op. Malik Sanborn didn't pound desks, didn't raise his voice. He spent the first 2 days reading, underlining, jotting notes in the margins, like a man thawing out an old frozen machine, in a small room at the far end of the 3rd-floor hallway. He requested only natural light, fluorescent bulbs, because my reading habits can't tolerate buzzing tubes. Page by page, the files unfolded, not to confirm that Hurley was wrong, but to answer a larger question. Had the system ever recognized what he did as wrong? And the answer grew clear. 2 prior complaints about racial language, 1 about unlawful search, 1 procedural error that resulted in a broken arm, all recorded, labeled as internally resolved or insufficient grounds for discipline. Sanborn didn't react as he read. He merely closed each folder and marked the top right corner in red. On the 4th day, he opened his laptop and sent a brief email to the prosecutor's office. Request to expand scope of investigation must not end with individual case. Subject line, organizational culture. Outside, the press caught whispers but had nothing to go on. No one knew where he went or whom hem it. At City Hall, murmurs spread about the lawyer who doesn't like answering questions. But to Caleb Monroe, who had sat through more hearings than most lawmakers, one detail mattered most. If he's not on TV, it means he's still working. Malik Sanborn didn't investigate to be known. He investigated to know it all, and in the shadows of reports buried beneath hundreds of internal stamps, he traced every crack the system had learned to gloss over. The old words came into sharp focus under the lone red strokes of a pen held by someone who didn't need a microphone to make the system listen. On Thursday morning, Sanborn sat alone in the file room. 6 folders labeled Resolved laid out before him. He didn't need to dig deep, just flip through old reports to spot a behavioral pattern, clear enough not to be ignored. In 7 cases labeled Stop based on suspicion, the common denominator wasn't weapons, actions, or criminal history. It was black, wearing a suit, walking alone. Sanborn didn't see these as statistics. He saw them as arrhythmic pulses in the nervous system map of the entire force. Each case had been logged as no violation found and shelved without any follow-up training. One case had even earned commendation for quick response to a suspicious individual in a residential area. He reread each report. Familiar phrases surfaced, did not fit the context. Gait inconsistent with area. Wearing a suit without visible ID. One man was stopped leaving his office building after hours. Another was detained at a train station for stepping out of an expensive SUV. One searched for a phone call near a mall ATM. Sanborn underlined the phrase gait inconsistent with area. It appeared in 4 out of 7 reports, without photos, without video, and without further evidence. He paused on the thinnest file. The incident had happened the previous year and caused no stir since no one was hurt. A black man was stopped after exiting a bank. He wore a blue suit and carried a leather briefcase. The officer's report read, "He seemed like he was trying to prove something." That alone had justified a street ID check. Sanborn closed the file, wrote a note on the cover in black ink. No red flags, no capital letters. This is not an incident. This is evidence of a distorted frame of reference, previously rewarded. That line was later photographed and circulated among staff at the prosecutor's office. No one shared it publicly, but everyone understood. This was no longer about one officer's misconduct. It was about a system that had rewarded deviation when dressed in the language of proactive policing. Sanborn filed the folder, then sent a short email to 2 aides. "I need all commendation records related to Hurley past 3 years. Subject line, rewarded errors." As he left the reading room, he carried nothing but a small notebook. On its final page, one line had been underlined. "Every pattern leaves a trace, even the pattern of silence." In the long hallway leading back to the main office, staff passed him without speaking, quietly eyeing the worn leather bag in his left hand. It wasn't heavy, but for the first time they felt its weight, bearing the gravity of an entire ideology being turned over piece by piece, beat by beat, by someone quiet but fluent in the language of repetition. The courtroom that day wasn't large. Though called a closed hearing, every seat was filled. 1 row for the press, 1 for independent observers, and a few seats for representatives from the prosecutor's office. The others sat behind frosted glass, faces unseen. No clip-on mics, no official cameras. Not even the hum of a ceiling fan broke the silence. Blake Hurley entered without making eye contact. He wore a suit, a muted gray one, collar slightly wrinkled. For the first time since his name had appeared in headlines, he wasn't in uniform. No one had ordered the change. He chose it himself, perhaps to avoid seeming confrontational, or maybe to be addressed by something other than his rank. Seated at the opposite table, Malik Sanborn opened a thick file, then closed it again in a gesture that seemed to compress the air. He didn't look at the papers, but straight at the man before him. "Why aren't you wearing your uniform today?" His tone wasn't accusatory, just checking a premise. Blake answered without hesitation, "I want to be seen, not as a cop, but as a person." The answer was recorded, but before anyone could respond, Sanborn spoke again. "Then what did Mr. Monroe?" The room seemed to contract in a single breath. Blake leaned forward slightly, then sat back. His hands rested loosely on his knees. He blinked once, his lips parted, but no words came at first. Every gaze turned toward him, not accusing, but wait. "I don't know," he said softly. "At the time, I just thought something was off. A man standing still in a suit, not going anywhere. I wasn't used to that image." Sanborn didn't write anything. He let the words hang in the air. Then he asked, "Do you think, if that man had been white, wearing the same clothes, in the same spot, your reaction would have been the same?" Blake looked up. This time his eyes drifted slowly across the ceiling, as if searching for a place to escape the question. Finally he answered, "I hope so, but I can't say for sure." A response that didn't defend itself, nor did it confess guilt, just the words of someone realizing, maybe for the first time, that he wasn't entirely innocent in thoughts shaped by things no one teaches, but everyone absorbs. Sanborn nodded slightly. No praise, no notes. He simply reopened the file, flipped to a page marked in bold, "Reason for suspicion, out of place in environment. He slid the photocopy across the table. What do you think someone has to wear to belong in an environment? Blake held the paper, stared, didn't answer. And if I said today, Sanborn continued slowly, that because you're wearing a suit I find you suspicious, because you don't look like someone who usually wears suits, would you find that absurd? Blake pressed his fingertips together on the table, nodded, didn't smile. No one applauded. No one left their seat, but the atmosphere shifted, not because of what Hurley admitted, but because he no longer dodged. In that small room, the questions weren't meant to prosecute, but to tear open the blur between function and reflex. Sanborn didn't need him to bow his head. He only made him confront the lens through which another man had to raise his badge just to be left in peace. Outside, clouds drifted past the long windows. No courtroom ruling could end the silence of an entire system, but in this moment, between one man laying down a command and another laying down his badge, at least one question no longer lived on paper. The moment stretched as no one spoke. All eyes followed every small movement of Blake Hurley, no longer seen through the role of an officer but as a man, exposed by the very structure that once shielded him. Sanborn didn't press, didn't soften his tone. He let the room hold tension through silence, not for dramatic effect but because truth often surfaces clearest when people stop arguing. Then Blake spoke, quietly, like pulling a word from deep in his chest. A risk. Sanborn paused, then scribbled a note in the margin of his notebook. Not a person? Hurley didn't answer. He bowed his head, not to evade, but as if the weight of that admission itself kept him from lifting it again. No one corrected him, no one stood to object. Everyone understood. Among thousands of hours of training, thousands of hours on patrol, nowhere in the curriculum did it require learning, truly learning, how to see someone as a human being instead of a probability or potential threat. The problem wasn't whether a gun was drawn, it was that someone was looked at as if they might be wrong before they ever did a thing. The prosecution stepped forward, no preamble, no dramatic call for charges, no reenactment of events. The lead attorney pointed to 4 slim case files, accompanied by a summary of testimony citing 3 key findings: repeated behavior, systemic racial bias, and lack of capacity to regulate instinctual conduct. "We are not requesting prison time," the attorney said, eyes fixed not on Hurley but squarely on the row of police representatives. "We are requesting something else. Permanent disqualification from law enforcement." A soft rustle moved through the room, not because the penalty was harsh, but because it was precise. The reason was entered directly into the record: inherent prejudice within a public authority environment, no longer labeled administrative misconduct, no longer excused as an impulsive lapse. This time, the term used was inherent 10, an inherent mental defect capable of spreading if left unchecked. Sanborn added nothing. He closed his notebook, didn't look at Hurley, didn't glance at the audience, didn't return to his desk. He stood, carrying the only file he hadn't opened, the investigation into the chain of actors who had enabled this behavior, still sealed. The judge announced a recess for deliberation. It would take 7 days to deliver a final ruling. In those 7 days, no one would know if Blake Hurley would leave the city or stay to hear the verdict read aloud. But one thing was certain: regardless of what the court decided, the greater judgment had already been delivered. Through society's sharpened understanding of how a suit, a skin tone, and a silent stance on a sidewalk could become enough reason for a gun to tremble. On the way out, a young journalist jotted a line into her notebook: "A man's career may end for one action, but an entire culture must be tried for the reflex that created it." But he didn't tap on any saved name. He simply picked up the landline and dialed a number etched into memory from the internal investigation file. Blake Hurley answered after 2 rings. His voice wasn't cold nor broken. It was just a dry hello, like someone who no longer knew how to start a conversation without bracing for impact. Caleb didn't greet him, didn't introduce himself, didn't circle around. He went straight to the only reason this call existed. "I'm not calling to prove you were wrong. I want to know, if there had been no camera, would you still believe you were right?" The line went quiet. No sigh, no chair creaking. Even breath seemed caught somewhere in the back of the throat. It wasn't refusal. It felt as though in that instant Blake had been pulled back to Jefferson Street, to a morning with wind, a child's scream, and his hand closer to the trigger than to any thought. Caleb didn't push, didn't repeat the question. He kept his tone steady, just loud enough to be heard, just clear enough not to be mistaken for accusation. On the other end, breathing returned, soft and measured, as if each word had to be weighed. Then Blake spoke, slowly and plainly. I thought I wasn't wrong, because I trusted what I felt was right. Caleb didn't interrupt. He waited. Blake continued. But now I understand. That feeling, it didn't come from truth. It came from habit. And that habit was trained, rewarded, preserved. Caleb closed his eyes for a second, then opened them. He rested a hand on the table, voice low. So if there'd been no footage that day, do you think people would still have believed you were right? This time, Blake answered immediately, yes, because everything in the system was built to protect someone like me, not someone like you. That confession, even belated, landed on the surface of truth like a drop of water on fractured glass. It didn't shatter, but it didn't vanish either. Caleb didn't respond. He only said one final thing. I didn't call to forgive. I called to make sure that next time you're standing in front of someone, with no camera, no badge, no suit, you'll still see them as a person. Silence followed. But before the line went dead, Blake said, I understand. The call ended with no thank you, no meeting arranged. It wasn't recorded, never entered into official transcripts. But for both of them, it was the final piece in a series of events that no courtroom could fully adjudicate and no hashtag could truly convey. A moment where change didn't shout, didn't shine, but began anyway. From a call without raised voices, where no one had to win and no one was allowed to look away like before. With only two voices on the line and silence settling just right between them, Caleb Monroe asked a question not found in the script of any hearing. If tomorrow I'm no longer chief, what will you call me? His voice held its pace, no doubt, no dramatic pause. He asked as if lifting the veil off an answer everyone knew but no one dared name. Blake Hurley didn't respond right away. There was a stretch between breath and silence, as if he were looking at Caleb's face, but only the one inside his mind, the one without a badge, without a suit, without a headlight. I don't know, Blake replied, hoarse, nearly unrecognizable from the man who once yelled at someone in the street, not knowing. A reply that might sound neutral, but it was the clearest proof of what Caleb needed to hear, to confirm what he had always believed to be true. Respect from people like Hurley never began with humanity, but with the presence of power. And when that power disappears, humanity has no place left to stand. Caleb didn't sigh. He didn't raise his voice. He simply continued, brief and final, as if sealing off a thought that had stretched from an unfired bullet that morning to the hundreds of thousands of reactions that followed. I know. You'll call me something other than a person again, and that's what I came to change, not for me, but for the next one who won't have a badge. That closing needed no drama. It was the distilled truth of an entire lived experience that no administrative report could record. Caleb didn't wait for a reply. He hung up when he felt the words had landed where they needed to, on the right person, at the right time. There was no goodbye from the other end, but something more important had taken shape. A boundary had just been drawn, not with power, but with truth. After the call, Caleb didn't write down what was said and didn't tell anyone. He stepped out of his office and walked straight to the window overlooking Jefferson Street. No more police tape, no more patrol cars. Just the old stone bench where the little girl had once sat. He stood for a few seconds, then turned away. He didn't need to stay to see what was changing, because what needed to change was bigger than him. The afternoon passed in other offices, with hundreds of report lines, closed-door meetings, and emails referencing the incident that affected the department's image. But somewhere, a brief phone call had etched a small crack into the reflective glass of the system, where a man who once saw others as risks now had to name the shadow within himself. As dusk settled over the roof of City Hall, Caleb Monroe returned to his desk and opened a folder titled Internal Communication Not for Release. He added a final note, didn't send it, didn't upload it into the system, just left it there like a quiet instruction. Each time he sees a black man in a suit, I want him to remember he once didn't know what to call them, and I want no one else to ever have to ask that question again. The courtroom on that rainy morning was quiet. No long lines outside, no reporters pushing for space, no chance of protest or support on the sidewalk. Only the stillness of an outcome everyone knew was coming, and the people who entered didn't bring expectations, they brought something greater, confirmation that a system could reach the edge of its own design. The court convened on time. No one gave long speeches. No one tried to submit more evidence. Everything had already been in the hands of the panel of judges for days, reviewed thoroughly and sealed tightly to prevent public pressure. When the presiding judge read the sentence, his voice didn't rise, didn't pause for emphasis. He just read each word, each period. The court finds that the defendant, Blake Hurley, engaged in repeated acts of implicit racial bias during the execution of his duties. These actions were not isolated, not circumstantial, but reflective of the absorption and repetition of a skewed framework. The court rules permanent revocation of law enforcement credentials. The defendant is prohibited from serving in any law enforcement agency within the state. Notation added to file, behavior consistent with structural bias. No one shouted. No one exhaled. The courtroom remained wrapped in the same heavy air as it had during the very first hearing, only this time the conclusion had hit bottom. Blake Hurley stayed still. His hands rested on his thighs. He didn't bow, didn't lift his chin, didn't object. A man who once shouted in another man's face in public, who once reached for his gun just because someone stood still too long, now chose to withdraw in silence. Not necessarily from remorse, but perhaps because he knew his voice no longer carried weight. When the judge closed the verdict folder, Blake stood, walked slowly to the wooden podium. He didn't ask for leniency, he didn't request reconsideration. He only said, "I would like to keep the badge, not for me, for my father." The room didn't react. The judge sat quietly for a few seconds, then asked, "Why?" Blake replied, "He used to be a police officer. I think he needs to see that I carried." The judge tilted his head, his tone unchanged. "He doesn't need to see the badge, he needs to see the man who held it." Then he signaled the legal clerk to note, "Request to retain badge denied. Reason, a symbol holds no value when detached from dignity." That line was repeated across many internal forms, not to praise or condemn, but to pose a deeper question. Since when did a symbol come to matter more than the conduct of the person who bore it? And if that person no longer deserves it, should the symbol remain, or be removed to erase the disguise that covered the system for far too long? The sentencing ended with no winners. No one was thrown stones at. People walked out of the courtroom in silence, not because they didn't care, but because they understood this wasn't the end of a person. It was a turning point for a system forced to re-examine itself, not by law, but by consequence. Caleb Monroe did not attend the sentencing, not out of apathy or detachment from the outcome, but because he knew his presence at that moment would shift the focus away from where it belonged. This was no longer a confrontation between two individuals, but a time for the system to look itself in the face. Still, he left behind a handwritten note, folded in half, delivered directly to the court clerk the day before, with instructions to be read aloud at the end of the session. The paper bore no logo, no official stamp, just slanted handwriting in blue ink on pale yellow paper, signed simply CM in the bottom corner. When the clerk stood, opened the note, and began reading, the courtroom did not stir. No one knew the content beforehand, but no one needed to prepare. Change does not come from sentencing. It comes when the system finally admits no one is exempt from accountability just because they once wore a uniform. The reading was not loud, not dramatic, but in that moment, the entire room seemed to pause, so the words could fall on each person without slipping past. It was not forgiveness, and it was not farewell. It was a statement of truth, meant to stop history from continuing under new names with the same roots. When the hearing ended, no one stood up first. The room needed a few seconds for everyone to peel themselves away from the silence that had coated it from beginning to end. No one cried, no one raised their voice. The footsteps leaving the courtroom were quiet, as if people were exiting a memorial, not for a person, but for a mindset, for a kind of impunity that had lived in the shadows of a badge. At the same time, inside a small precinct building where Hurley had once worked, a technical staff member entered to clear out any personal belongings left behind. He worked quietly without asking for assistance. When he reached the main desk, he looked up and saw the nameplate, still fixed in place, its engraved metal slightly tarnished. He removed it with a small screwdriver, wiping away the dust that had gathered over weeks of neglect. Behind the nameplate, carved faintly into the wood with an old blade, was a phrase, "To serve and protect," the long-standing motto of the force. A phrase once repeated like gospel, but in that moment, under the dim yellow desk lamp, it no longer rang with pride. It resembled more a question that had long been mistaken for an answer. And just below it, in faint red pencil, someone, unclear who or when, had written a single word, no flourish, no punctuation. One word, no question mark, but it bent the motto above, as if finally the real question had taken form. Not what it meant to serve and protect, but whom it was meant for, and for how long. Others had stood outside that promise. The technician placed the nameplate into a sealed bag, leaving the red mark untouched. He folded the chair, turned off the light, and left the room, carrying with him a piece of metal no longer in use, but etched with the weight of a system that once believed power could exist apart from responsibility. On Monday morning, in a public high school on the northern edge of the city, a small board hung outside the sociology classroom. There was no lecture title, no curriculum name, and no attendance content. Just a single, slanted line of white chalk. Today, say nothing. Listen again to what has been overheard too often. No one was asked to take notes. The teacher walked in, nodded to the class, then played the original video that had once spread across social media, the clip of Officer Blake Hurley calling Caleb Monroe a monkey on the corner of Jefferson Street. The cut was unedited, silent, no music, no captions. The screen was large, the audio raw. The entire class went still, like a sheet of glass waiting to crack. After the video ended, still no one spoke. There was no quiz, no breakdown, no analysis. The teacher sat down, rested her hands on the desk. Silence. A minute later, a male student stood up, white, dark blonde hair, wearing a sweatshirt with the school logo. His voice wasn't sharp or smug, but honest, as if calling himself out. If it were me, I think I would have spoken up. For a few seconds, the class didn't respond. No agreement, no rebuttal. Then the girl next to him, of Asian descent with the last name Nguyen, turned and replied softly, "And if it wasn't Eric Dow filming, then what?" That question didn't challenge. It layered in a reality the classroom rarely confronted head-on. The instinct to speak out is not enough if listening only happens when the narrator fits a familiar face. Eric Dow, the Vietnamese student who was slapped once for speaking up, only gained recognition when he became the guy who filmed at the right time. But if the camera had been held by someone else, someone less clearly aligned with the victim, someone the community empathized with less, would the video have gone viral or been dismissed as one-sided footage? The student sat down, didn't push back. He nodded as if realizing silence too can be an action. The teacher said nothing more. She turned off the projector, then wrote another line on the board. This isn't about who's right or wrong. It's about who gets to be wrong and still be heard. No one answered, but a girl in the back row pulled out her notebook, copied the sentence down, and underlined it twice. In a corner of the room, a black student, usually quiet, looked out the window, his eyes catching the sunlight breaking through the glass. He didn't need to speak. His face answered a question no curriculum had ever printed. And just like that, the lesson ended with no roll call, no grading, but by noon the video was shared again, this time by a student from that very class. The caption had no hashtags, just a single line. Some stories don't grow old. We've just grown too used to their sound. After the silent class, the teacher gave an assignment. Not an essay in format, no rubric, no citation required, just one sentence. Write 500 words answering, "Who are you?" if no one knows your title. No elaboration, no hints. She said, "You don't have to turn it in if you have nothing to say, but if you do, leave the page blank, except for your answer at the bottom." The next day, each paper was placed silently on the teacher's desk. Some were filled with messy handwriting, recounting times they were misnamed, mistaken for someone else because of their clothes. Others admitted to always introducing themselves with titles, afraid that if they didn't, people would overlook the rest. But some pages were completely blank. No header, no body paragraphs. Just a single sentence tucked at the bottom, written carefully as if for themselves. "I've never thought about that." The teacher didn't grade them. She didn't comment. She simply read each one, then pinned them on the back wall of the classroom, where once hung seating charts, semester plans, and attendance sheets. Now, layered like fish scales, were those blank pages, tilted just enough that no one could tell which belonged to whom. No names, and that was right, because the question by nature wasn't meant to be attached to a specific identity. It only needed to be asked, so everyone could see just how many people have defined themselves by nameplates, uniforms, or LinkedIn titles, without once asking, if that were gone, what's left of me? The teacher offered no further explanation. She left a slip of paper on the lectern with block letters. A title should not be the only thing keeping you from being dismissed. From that day on, the blank pages stayed up all semester. Not for aesthetics, not to inspire, but so that whenever someone said, "He was the chief and still got insulted," someone else could glance at the wall and know that very thought is what needs rewriting. At the final press conference of the year, the stage lighting was dimmed just enough not to overpower the deep brown hue of the wooden backdrop. There were no banners reading "Justice Won," no posters with Caleb Monroe's face, just a podium and rows of press seats, filled by journalists who, for the first time, didn't need the story to sell headlines, because the man at the center had already refused to be the center. When a reporter from a major newspaper stood up and asked, in a tone wrapped in subtle praise yet loaded with personal framing, "Mr. Monroe, how do you feel after everything that happened? After all you've done, do you think you've changed the game?" Caleb Monroe stood tall, hands resting on the podium the same way he had at security hearings before, but this time his gaze wasn't aimed at the questioner. He looked to the last row, where a group of student interns had been granted access as observers. His response was brief. "I'm not the focus." That line wasn't a modest deflection or a rhetorical dodge. It was a statement of principle, a way of removing ego from a narrative that had never begun with him and should not end with him either. Another reporter, younger, followed up. "Then who do you think made the difference?" Caleb didn't hesitate. He answered almost instantly. Two of them lived in faith. Now, him, the one who recorded the video, Eric Dow. He acted. I just stood still. The room fell quiet for a few seconds. Not because Eric's name was unknown, but because no one had heard Caleb so plainly admit that he wasn't the one who confronted, but the one who was confronted. His stillness, now redefined, was no longer called bravery, but a forced response. Because, had he reacted any other way, he would have been labeled aggressive. A female journalist, seated to the right, nodded, not to the quote itself, but to the shift in how Caleb had redefined his own role, not as a protagonist, but as a reflective surface. Caleb continued. This isn't about me. It's about how we let a pattern go on for so long without anyone stopping it, that students stopped it not by intervening, not by pushing back, but by letting the truth reveal itself. The tone in the room began to shift. The questions moved away from Caleb's experience and toward upcoming training reforms, recruitment processes, and how people like Eric could be seen not as lucky bystanders with cameras, but as system-level alarms, people who held up the mirror, not for glory, but for clarity. Caleb Monroe stepped back from the podium, ending not with a grand quote or a rallying cry. He simply said, I stood still that day not to become a symbol. I stood still because I knew, in a system where people are only heard when they have a title, the next person, without a badge, without a camera, without luck, might not be standing to tell the story at all. He bowed his head, not waiting for applause. And so, the man who had once been called inhuman chose to step away from the center, forcing everyone to look at the full picture, where there was a person filming, people watching, people staying silent, and one man standing in the middle. Karba, the man said. The community talk at the Central Library took place over the weekend. No press, no live broadcast. It was simply a gathering hosted by a group of parents and the city council, with guest speakers including Caleb Monroe and a few representatives from the education department, meant to create a space where children and adults could ask questions about what happened and what might keep happening if people didn't start asking the right ones. The shared room was packed. Chairs were arranged in a circle. Children sat in the front row, adults behind them. There was no podium. Caleb sat in the same row as everyone else, the only difference being a glass of water in front of him and a small pad of paper for notes, still blank. Midway through the discussion, after a few questions about his work and leadership, a young girl stood up. She looked about 8 years old, white, with braided hair and pale blue eyes, her voice hesitant but clear. Do I have to say sorry for my skin color? The question fell into the room like a pebble into still water. No one laughed. No one whispered. All eyes turned to the girl, not to judge, but to hold their breath, because what she had just asked was something many adults had avoided, redirected, or answered by not answering at all. Caleb sat upright. He didn't lean forward, didn't soften his tone, and spoke as if talking to his own granddaughter. No, you don't have to say sorry for your skin color. Skin color doesn't need an apology, but you must apologize if you stay silent in the face of wrong, especially when that wrong treats others like they are less. The answer wasn't long. It didn't explain much, but it was enough for the girl to nod as if it made sense. And perhaps for the first time she had heard it stated as a principle, not an emotion, not an evasion. A parent in the second row began to cry, not because of what had just been said, but because the daughter turned back, took her mother's hand, and asked, "Why didn't you ever teach me that?" The mother couldn't answer, not because she lacked the words, but because her mind was flipping through hundreds of silences. Times she saw injustice in public, but just pulled her child away. Times she heard cruel words and turned aside out of discomfort. Times she said, "Everyone's equal," instead of naming the problem. Caleb didn't interrupt that moment. He stayed silent, allowing a child and a mother to face each other through a question that schools, media, and law had all long avoided. And it was in that moment he knew. The words had landed not because they were loud, but because someone finally asked right, and someone didn't look away. The gathering ended without a summary lesson. No report cards, no final points, but in a corner of the library, a young girl had asked something millions of adults had never considered, and in her mother's eyes, something cracked, not belief, but the coat of gloss long used to hide the questions that should have been asked generations ago. In March, a new training program was officially introduced across the state's officer training system. The program's name wasn't flashy or full of grand slogans. It was simply listed on the guide sheet: Nonviolent Response and Bias Control. A small line beneath the title was bolded, "Not to change what you see, but to ask, Why do you see it that way? The first class was held in a softly lit room. The chairs were arranged low, there was no podium, no senior officer speaking from personal experience. The instructor was a middle-aged woman of brown descent, a former strategic advisor to international peacekeeping organizations. She entered without introducing her qualifications or title. She simply opened the first slide. The question appeared on the screen. What do you see when no one tells you what to see? No images, no illustrations. Just a question, hanging, waiting for someone to bring it down to the table and dare to place themselves in the middle of the answer. She didn't ask anyone to answer. She didn't explain the question. She moved to the next slide, transitioning to a simulation scenario. Two video clips appeared side by side. A white man in a suit walks into a conference room holding a phone. A black man in a similar suit enters at the same time, holding his phone, standing at the other end of the room. No sound, no captions, no unusual action. The only instruction given to the 120 young officers: you've been assigned to monitor suspicious behavior in the room. Who will you check first? They had 10 seconds to choose. No explanations, no immediate discussions. The results were shown immediately. 68% of officers chose the black man. No one was reprimanded. There were no warnings. No right or wrong ranking. The next screen displayed another question. Why do you think you chose that way? At this point, the room began to speak. One person raised their hand because he didn't make eye contact. Another said, the white man walked closer to the conference table. I thought he had a reason. A quieter voice. I don't know, maybe because I'm used to seeing people like him in suspicious reports. The instructor didn't counter, didn't confirm. She simply highlighted a line on the projector. It's not about what you think, it's about what you've been taught to see, where it comes from, and how. The rest of the class continued with similar scenarios, each presented not to judge but to push the students into uncomfortable territory, where the rationale behind their actions was no longer protected by habits or uniforms, but had to be dissected by the very gaps that had become reflex. The training ended without a summary, no final exam. Each student was handed a piece of paper with only one blank line. Write a question you don't want to answer. No one was forced to submit their answers, but most folded the paper and placed it on the table before leaving. Those papers were not stored in any files. They were kept in a sealed envelope, labeled with the name of the session, but without the writer's name. A young officer, as he walked out into the hallway, glanced back at the now blank slide screen and mumbled to his group, maybe the question isn't meant to be answered, but to be held in your mind each time your hand touches the flashlight. In the internal report collected after each training session, the free entry journal section was always the least read. It didn't affect grades, and it wasn't used to evaluate promotions or achievements. But in the new training program, it became the one section that wasn't monitored, the only part that could say what the tests couldn't capture. A new female officer, 25 years old, with a psychology degree, wrote on the last page of her training journal, "Thought I wasn't biased, until I was asked to explain why I thought that." The sentence was short, no bullet points, no parentheses for notes. But the handwriting became bolder toward the end, like it carried an inner struggle that was hard to name, because in the early days of training, when everyone was eager to prove themselves clean, objective, the one thing no one dared to admit was prejudice doesn't always wear the face of hate. Often it wears the cloak of blind confidence in one's own goodness. The supervisor read that line at the end of the debriefing. He didn't record the writer's name, nor did he forward it to the evaluation system. He simply printed it out, folded it, and pinned it on the bulletin board outside the final session room, under the title, "Ask Yourself Before You Wear the Uniform." Below it was the last line of the lecture, printed the previous week, also without an author's name and, most importantly, without a period. I'm not ready to judge anyone until I understand myself. One of the trainees pointed to the line and asked, "Is this a typo or intentional?" The instructor didn't answer directly, she just smiled and nodded, as if implying that question is part of the lesson. That phrase became the most frequently referenced topic after the course. Some wrote it down in their personal notebooks. Some copied it into internal training files with the note to be included in the self-assessment at the end of each shift. But some didn't write it down, didn't copy it. They simply kept it in their heads like a warning, not to forbid, but to make every action reconsidered from its roots. Because after the Monroe incident, the definition of understanding oneself was no longer an empty philosophy. It became the foundation for trustworthiness, the basis for an officer to step onto the street not to protect the power of their uniform, but because they didn't want to undermine the dignity of the person they faced. And in the hallway where that line was posted, there were no surveillance cameras, no fingerprint scanners for entry. Only the feet slowed down, just a beat longer, when a new person first encountered it. One full year after the Jefferson Street incident, November 5th came again without any commemorative banners, no memorial service, no moments of silence declared by the government or the justice system. There were no posters with the phrase "never forget," and no organizations took responsibility for making the day a symbol. But in many places, a different kind of quiet began to unfold, not through trumpets or drums, but through fabric and gaze. At a school in the southern part of the city, the entire faculty wore dark suits. No one mentioned why, but each student recognized it, because in the weekly uniform guidelines, under Tuesday, there was a faint note: attire, formal, neat, no patterns. At a bus stop near City Hall, the woman selling newspapers adjusted the collar of her charcoal gray vest, the one she only wore on important occasions. The librarian, usually in a soft beige cardigan, that day wore a white shirt, black pants, and polished leather shoes. They didn't dress to commemorate anyone specific. They dressed because of what had happened to a man in a suit, standing still being stopped, and only when he pulled out his badge was he spared from prejudice. These outfits became a silent reminder. Appearance can't protect anyone if the viewer isn't ready to remove their filter. At the Central Police Station, a young officer placed a handwritten envelope into the internal mail tray, addressed to Caleb Monroe, who was on a short leave at the time. The handwritten letter, in blue ink on plain paper, had no formal heading. Dear Mr. Monroe, I am a second-year officer at Precinct 7. I joined the force because I believed in the badge, the shiny emblem pinned to my chest that made me feel safe as a child watching my father go to work every day. But after your incident and the new training sessions, I started to understand something no one had ever taught me before. The badge does not create justice. It is just a symbol, and it is behavior, the behavior of the one wearing it, that makes justice happen. And conversely, that same behavior can destroy everything the badge was meant to protect. I'm not writing for advice. I just wanted to say, since I learned this, I've been doing every shift as if the person I'm facing doesn't have a badge, so I won't forget that justice doesn't begin with checking an ID, but by seeing someone as a true human being. The letter ended with no signature, just 3 short words: a person learning. Caleb read the letter that same afternoon upon returning to his office. He didn't respond, nor did he note the sender's name. Instead, he removed the old wooden plaque behind his desk, which had read the old slogan, "Justice through Strength," and replaced it with a plain sheet of paper framed in glass. Justice doesn't wear metal, it wears behavior. Under the glass, there was no author's name, and that's how he wanted it to stay. Caleb Monroe didn't write a reply to the letter from the young officer. He didn't ask his secretary to respond on his behalf, nor did he offer any public advice, whether in a quote or a speech, for recording. But he did something else, quietly and deliberately. He took down the landscape painting that had hung behind him throughout his tenure and replaced it with an old black-and-white framed photo of a white man, with deep eyes and a straight back. It was a photo of Richard Calloway, the former police chief from 2 generations ago, who had been attacked for opposing a bill that would limit legal access for minority groups. He was someone who hadn't spoken loudly, but left behind one sentence, recorded in internal documents few had ever read. Justice is for those you disagree with to still treat them as human. Caleb silently framed that sentence without placing Calloway's name underneath or adding a date. He hung the photo on the west wall, not at the center of the room, but just enough that anyone sitting at his desk would see it. As a reminder, ideals don't always come with applause. Often they sit behind you, like a silent witness. Also that day, in a residential area 30 miles from downtown, a child was playing with Lego on the living room carpet. The boy, about 7 years old, with brown skin and curly hair, wearing a plaid shirt, had a strangely focused expression. He wasn't building a spaceship, nor was he creating a towering city as usual. Before him was a model of a police station, built from simple blocks, with the entrance blocked by 2 gray bricks, symbolizing a security gate. In his hand was a small figure, dressed in a black suit, the only black Lego character in his collection. His mother walked in and asked, "What are you building?" The boy didn't look up. He slowly placed the black figure in the center of the police station yard, then answered, "I'm starting over, so that person is here from the beginning." His Highness would like to remove the poor. There was no video recording of that moment, no hashtags or viral posts, but in that instant, something was formed that no curriculum could teach. Fairness doesn't come from fixing mistakes, but from not erasing anyone from the foundation. And if anyone asks whether the events on Jefferson Street changed anything, perhaps no answer is needed from Congress, the Department of Justice, or any public official. Just ask a child, rearranging the world in what it believes is the right order and choosing to place someone who was once excluded in the very center. Caleb Monroe left office after 2 terms without ever being late, without a single scandal, and without a speech that would go down in history. His last day was not covered live, there was no crowded farewell, and no band played the traditional anthem of the department. It was simply a closed session at the city council, where he sat in the same chair as usual, listening to annual reports and nodding lightly when it was his turn to speak. He stood up, but didn't say anything. He placed a thick folder on the conference table, its brown spine with a handwritten white label, "Report on Implicit Bias Behavior Over the Past 10 Years." No introduction, no legal affirmation. He nodded once, gently, like a habitual gesture, when leaving a late meeting, then quietly walked out. The documents he left behind would later serve as the foundation for creating an internal ethics scoring system, but no one would mention his name in the contributors section. That same week, his successor was announced, a woman of Asian descent, Ms. Lin, who had been the deputy director of the Office of Ethics and Internal Oversight. She had never run for office, never appeared in the media, and over 15 years of service, she was known for 3 things: straightforwardness, leaving no traces of power, and never refusing to investigate those above her. At the swearing-in ceremony, she wore a dark suit, no jewelry, didn't invite family members, and didn't give a prepared speech. When she stepped up to the podium, she looked straight into the camera, her voice steady as a rock. "I'm not here to continue the power. I'm here because someone didn't need to use power to protect dignity." The room was as silent as a memorial. No one clapped, but those who understood the words, understood she was speaking of Caleb, bowed their heads lightly. Not to honor the one who had left, but to accept what was beginning. For the first time, a position was not given to the person who spoke the best, but to the one who understood when silence was needed for change to speak for itself. That day, Caleb wasn't present. He was at a small bookstore on the west side of the city, buying a novel for his granddaughter, soon to enter college. A book with no mention of police officers, no dialogue about justice, just the story of an ordinary person trying to live decently in a small world. When the store clerk asked for his signature because they recognized him, Caleb smiled, took the pen, and then stopped. "What name would you like to sign with, sir? Former police chief?" He shook his head. "Just Caleb. If a name needs a title to be trusted, then that name isn't enough." The clerk looked up and nodded gently, and in that book, on the first page, in clear handwriting, for the next reader, someone who doesn't need a business card to be heard. A few months after Caleb Monroe left office, a small museum on the east side of the city quietly opened a new exhibition. There was no grand opening, no media coverage, just a small wooden sign posted outside. Exhibit Power and Dignity. The room contained 3 display cases, a screen showing video clips, and a few large printed photographs. But in the center of the exhibition, under anti-reflective glass, was the one item that drew every eye: an old leather badge, silver-edged, engraved with Caleb Monroe's name and the title Chief of Police. Beneath the badge there was no biography, no dates of service, no list of accomplishments, just a single line etched in small font centered on the black wood. Didn't flash this to gain power, he revealed it to show what power forgets. The words needed no explanation. Those who entered would either understand or not, but most of the people who stood in front of the badge longer than any other artifact were in the majority. That badge didn't inspire pride, it served as a reminder. Some powers only hold value when drawn not to threaten, but to remind others of a boundary they'd just crossed. Outside the city, where a former police station once stood, now converted into a community center, the brick wall on the facade still bore its original faded color. No one had repainted it, not because of budget constraints, but because someone had left a question on it. It wasn't ornate, it wasn't full of anger, just 4 words, painted in dark gray, as if he had no badge. Could you still see him? No signature, no hashtags, no declaration of the author. But that question appeared in hundreds of senior essays that year. Some included it in their introduction, some quoted it at the end like a final sigh. It didn't encourage an answer. It simply existed to remind us that how we perceive a person in this society often starts with a piece of metal and ends there unless challenged. Caleb Monroe never went to see the graffiti, but he heard about it from a local resident through a handwritten letter in purple ink with a scrawled message. I saw that line and thought, our children will need to read it many more times, because the adults are still answering wrong. He placed the letter in a drawer, along with others. Then, on a rare occasion, he sat down and wrote one single line in response to the stranger. Keep that question on the wall, and keep your child beside you to read it together. And so he left, without leaving a statue, without schools named after him, without any biographical film. All that remained were the questions, not closed, not erased, and not needing to be bolded, scattered throughout the city like faint scars, so that when the light is gentle enough, people will see them. Caleb Monroe didn't stand in the middle of the city like a hero. He didn't emerge from the crisis waving a flag, nor did he seize the spotlight from a moment of reversal. He simply stood still, on an ordinary street corner, on a morning no one expected, when a young officer called him a monkey. In the middle of a crowd, not knowing the man in the suit was the newly appointed police chief. And what brought change wasn't the power of the badge he held, but the fact that he didn't use it to intimidate or teach. He used it to ask, if I didn't have the badge, how far would this go? From that moment on, an entire system began reflecting upon itself, not because of an identity shock, but because a light touch had reached the deepest part of awareness, that human dignity is not determined by position or badge, but by how we are seen when there's nothing to prove our worth. Caleb didn't act like a victim demanding justice. He acted like someone placing a mirror before the one who had wronged him, so they could see themselves at their most vulnerable. The crisis that followed didn't stop at a court hearing or a firing decision. It spilled onto social media, into classrooms, police training programs, and into questions no one had ever wanted to ask. The one who filmed the video didn't become a hero, but a witness, holding on to a moment of truth that spoke louder than any twisted logic. Children began to ask questions about the role of skin color, about whether they should apologize for something they didn't choose, and adults, for the first time, couldn't look away. The police training system changed. Training sessions began with a question instead of an order. Officers were encouraged to think before reacting. A young officer wrote, "I thought I was fair until I was asked why I thought that." These journal entries weren't for self-criticism. They were meant to restart an ethical foundation that had been programmed with unconscious bias. Caleb Monroe's story didn't close with medals or a farewell speech. He left office quietly, leaving behind a file documenting 10 years of implicit bias behavior. His successor didn't continue a legacy of power, but of spirit. Power doesn't define dignity, and no one has the right to take it away. A museum displayed his chief's badge as a symbol, not of prestige, but of limits, of what power often forgets, to see people as people, even when they are no one. The graffiti on the old police station wall asked, "If he had no badge, would you still see him?" That question wasn't for the former officer. It was for society, for everyone walking down the street, looking at others through a lens that's never been removed. It doesn't demand an answer, it demands honesty. And perhaps the final lesson isn't in what Caleb did, but in what he didn't do. No anger, no retaliation, no attempt to be the center of attention. He stood still and forced the system to revolve around his question. He didn't wield his business card as a weapon, he held it up as a mirror. This story inspires not because of its unexpected twist, but because it touches on a core fear, that if a man in a suit, a chief, can still be called a monkey, then what is happening to millions of people who have nothing to protect them? And if we don't start changing with these questions, then justice, no matter how many slogans it's printed on, remains hollow, empty, and silent. Caleb Monroe left as he came, quietly, without a business card, and what remained wasn't the name, but what people would still see when they are forced to face themselves, in moments when no one is watching, no one is filming, and no one is standing up for them. That's when true justice begins.